There is a moment that many people experience, but very few ever talk about. It's the moment you share something that truly matters to you, and instead of encouragement, you're met with laughter. Not always loud laughter. Sometimes it's subtle, a dismissive comment, a quiet look that says they have already decided you're not capable of what you're talking about. That's exactly where his story began. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply spoke about a dream that had been sitting in his mind for a long time. The kind of dream that keeps you awake at night because it feels bigger than your current life. The kind of vision that excites you, but also scares you a little. And when he finally said it out loud, they laughed. In that moment, something shifted inside him. Not anger, not rage, something quieter than that. A feeling that sits heavy in your chest when you realize people don't see you the way you see yourself. You know that feeling. It's the feeling of being misunderstood before you even get the chance to prove who you are. The feeling of standing in a room where people have already decided the limits of your life. They didn't say it directly. They didn't need to. Their reactions said enough. They looked at him as if his dream was unrealistic. As if he was naive. As if he didn't understand how the world really worked. And maybe you've been in that exact situation before. You share a goal, a plan, or an idea, and instead of curiosity or support, you're met with doubt. Be realistic. People like us don't do things like that. You're thinking too big. Those kinds of words have a strange kind of power. Not because they are always true, but because they come from voices around you. Voices you've heard your whole life. Voices that slowly try to shrink your belief in yourself. And in that moment, you have a choice. Most people react immediately. They defend themselves. They argue. They try to convince everyone in the room that their dream makes sense. They explain, they justify, they push back against the laughter. But he didn't do that. He stood there quietly, not because he didn't feel the sting of their reaction. Of course he did. Anyone would. Being laughed at when you're sharing something meaningful is one of the fastest ways to feel small. But instead of fighting their reaction, he did something that looked like weakness on the outside. He stayed silent, and that silence confused them. They expected a reaction. They expected him to defend himself, to raise his voice, to argue about why they were wrong. But when that reaction never came, the moment passed in a strange way. They moved on. The conversation shifted. The room filled with other topics. But inside him, the moment didn't disappear. It became a quiet turning point. Because when people laugh at your dreams, two things can happen. Either their doubt becomes your limit, or it becomes a mirror that forces you to ask a deeper question. Do I believe in this enough to continue, even when nobody else does? That question is where real growth begins. You see, dreams rarely get mocked when they're small. Small goals are safe. They don't challenge anyone's expectations. But the moment you talk about something bigger, something unusual, something ambitious, people start reacting from their own fears. And that's what was really happening in that room. They weren't laughing at his potential. They were reacting to what they couldn't imagine for themselves. But he didn't explain that to them. He didn't try to correct them. He didn't try to force them to understand. Instead, he made a quiet decision in that moment. A decision that would shape everything that came next. If they were going to laugh, he would let them laugh. If they were going to doubt, he would let them doubt. Because some dreams aren't meant to be defended with words. Some dreams are meant to be protected in silence. The moment passed, but their voices didn't disappear. That's the strange thing about doubt from other people. It echoes. Long after the conversation ends, the words keep replaying in your mind. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself it didn't matter what they thought. He tried to move forward with the same excitement he had before he shared his dream. But something had changed. Before that day, the dream belonged only to him. It lived in a quiet space inside his mind, protected from judgment. But now their reactions had entered that space. And suddenly, every step forward felt heavier. Not because the dream was impossible, but because now it carried the weight of their doubt. You might know exactly what that feels like. You were working towards something important, but in the back of your mind, you can still hear their voices. Not loudly, just quietly enough to interrupt your focus. What if they were right? What if this really is unrealistic? What if I'm just embarrassing myself? Those thoughts don't arrive all at once. They appear slowly, usually in the quiet moments, when you're alone, when progress feels slow, when things don't go exactly the way you expected. And that's when their doubt becomes dangerous. Not because they said it, but because you start repeating it to yourself. They continued with their lives. They moved on to other conversations, other opinions, other things to talk about. But he was the one left carrying the pressure of their reaction. Every time he worked on his dream, he remembered the laughter. Every time he imagined the future he wanted, he also remembered the looks on their faces, the disbelief, the quiet dismissal, the sense that they had already decided the story of his life. That kind of pressure can make anyone question themselves. It's not always obvious on the outside. From the outside, it just looks like someone trying to improve their life. Someone working, learning, building something step by step. But internally, there's a constant tension. A part of you believes in what you're doing. Another part of you wonders if everyone else sees something you don't. And that tension can become exhausting, because it's not just about proving them wrong. It's about protecting your own belief long enough to see what's actually possible. Many people give up in this stage, not because they lack talent or discipline, but because the emotional pressure becomes too loud. They start explaining themselves constantly, trying to convince everyone around them that their dream makes sense. They defend every decision. They justify every step. They try to earn approval before they've even had the chance to create results. And slowly, the dream stops being something personal. It becomes a debate, a conversation, a constant argument with people who already decided they don't believe in it. He felt that pressure, too. There were moments when he thought about explaining everything more clearly. Moments when he imagined sitting down with them and showing them the logic behind his vision, explaining the plan, the steps, the possibilities they couldn't see yet. But deep down, something inside him resisted that idea, because the more he thought about it, the more he realized something important. People who doubt you rarely change their mind because of explanations. They're not waiting for more information. They're waiting for proof. And proof takes time. It takes effort. It takes quiet work that nobody sees in the beginning. So while they continued talking, forming opinions, and making assumptions about what he could or couldn't become, he faced a different kind of challenge. He had to learn how to move forward without their validation. He had to wake up every day and keep working on something that most people around him didn't believe in. And maybe the hardest part wasn't the work itself. It was learning how to carry the dream without constantly defending it. Because every time you explain yourself to people who already doubt you, you give their opinions more power than they deserve. And slowly, he started realizing something that would change the way he approached everything. Maybe the goal wasn't to convince them at all. Maybe the real challenge was learning how to continue, even while they misunderstood him. At some point, something inside him changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no big moment where everything suddenly became clear. It was quieter than that. A gradual realization that explaining himself was draining more energy than the actual work. For a while, he had tried to manage both. He tried to move forward, while also responding to the opinions around him. When they questioned his decisions, he answered. When they doubted his plans, he explained. And they made assumptions about what he was doing. He tried to correct them. But the more he did that, the more he noticed something strange. The conversations never really moved anything forward. No matter how carefully he explained his vision, they still saw it the same way. No matter how clearly he described the steps he was taking, their reactions stayed almost identical. Some nodded politely. Some smiled in a way that felt dismissive. Some offered advice that quietly suggested he should choose a safer path. And every time those conversations ended, he felt the same thing: exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. The kind that comes from trying to make people understand something they've already decided not to believe in. Eventually, he began to see the pattern. They weren't asking questions because they were curious. They were asking questions because they were skeptical. The questions weren't invitations to understand him. They were subtle ways of testing whether he would eventually admit they were right. That realization changed everything. Because once you see that pattern, you start understanding something important about human behavior. People rarely change their perspective because of explanations. They change their perspective when reality forces them to see something different. And reality takes time to build. So one day, without announcing it to anyone, he made a quiet decision. He stopped explaining. When they questioned his choices, he didn't argue. When they made sarcastic comments about his plans, he didn't respond. When they predicted that things wouldn't work out, he didn't try to prove them wrong in that moment. He simply listened and stayed calm. From the outside, it probably looked like he had nothing to say. Some people assumed he had lost confidence. Others thought he had quietly accepted their opinions. A fee. We even interpreted his silence as agreement. But inside, something completely different was happening. His silence wasn't surrender. It was discipline. Because staying quiet when you feel misunderstood requires more strength than reacting. Reacting is easy. Anyone can defend themselves. Anyone can raise their voice and try to win an argument. But choosing not to react, especially when you know people doubt you, requires control over your emotions. And that kind of control creates space. Space to think clearly. Space to focus. Space to invest energy in things that actually matter. He started noticing how much time he used to spend replaying conversations in his mind, thinking about what he should have said, imagining better responses, wondering how he could have made them understand. All of that mental energy disappeared once he stopped engaging. The silence created a boundary. Their opinions still existed, but they no longer controlled his attention. Instead of debating them in his mind, he redirected that focus toward the work itself. Each day became simpler. Wake up. Work on the dream. Improve something small. Move one step forward. No announcements, no arguments, no explanations. And something interesting began happening because of that choice. When you stop reacting, people lose the emotional response they were expecting. Some of them tried again to get a reaction from him. They repeated their doubts, made small jokes, or casually questioned whether he was still pursuing the same idea. But the reaction they expected never came. Just calm responses, short answers, or sometimes no answer at all. Eventually, the conversations became less frequent, not because they suddenly believed in his vision, but because there was nothing left to debate. Without arguments, without emotional reactions, without long explanations, the topic slowly lost tease. And your And while they continued living their lives, discussing other people and other opinions, he quietly shifted his attention to something far more powerful. Years later, the results spoke for themselves. Not in loud announcements, not in grand confrontations, but in quiet, undeniable evidence that the dream had been real all along. The same people who once laughed, who once questioned, who once doubted, now couldn't ignore what had been built. And yet, by that time, he had learned something crucial. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It had never been about them at all. He had discovered the true power of silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but intentional. The silence that protects energy, sharpens focus, and allows action to speak louder than words ever could. People often think silence is passive. They mistake stillness for weakness. But real silence, the silence that comes from emotional discipline, is active. It's a choice. A conscious decision to not give power to every doubt, every critique, every mocking voice that surrounds you. As he walked through the milestones of his journey, he realized that every step taken in quiet, deliberate action had been more effective than any argument he could have made. Every hour spent building, learning, refining, and growing in silence had compounded into results they couldn't have imagined. And while some of them began to notice, the shift in their perception didn't disturb him. He had stopped seeking their approval long before. It wasn't easy to get there. Learning not to react, especially when people mock or dismiss you, is one of the hardest lessons anyone can face. It requires tremendous emotional discipline. Every instinct in the human brain wants to respond, to justify, to defend, but he had learned that every time he engaged with doubt, he gave it life. Every reaction was like water to a flame that should have been left alone. Silence became the shield that protected his energy, and it became the weapon that allowed him to grow quietly but effectively. And as the years passed, something even more profound happened. He started noticing a change, not just in others, but in himself. His identity shifted. He was no longer the person who waited for validation, who feared judgment, who measured his worth based on other people's opinions. That version of himself had faded into memory. In its place was someone grounded, confident, and calm. Someone who understood that respect begins with oneself, and that inner power is cultivated through restraint, not reaction. When they finally recognized the success he had quietly built, it didn't feel like victory in the traditional sense. There was no need for confrontation, no need for celebration that demanded acknowledgement. He wasn't driven by the desire to teach them a lesson. He wasn't seeking revenge or recognition. The real triumph was the calm he felt in knowing that he had protected his vision and his integrity, that he had stayed true to himself, and that his energy had been invested in what truly mattered. The irony of it all was subtle, yet satisfying. The very people who once mocked him now looked at him with curiosity, maybe even admiration. But their opinions were irrelevant. He didn't need their validation because he had validated himself through every quiet, intentional step he had taken. And that, he realized, is the kind of power that cannot be taken away, the kind of power that doesn't need applause, because it exists quietly, rooted deeply in self-respect and disciplined action. In the end, the lesson was simple but profound. Silence, when used intentionally, is not absence, it is presence. Presence of mind, presence of focus, and presence of character. By choosing not to react, by protecting his energy, and by investing in what truly mattered, he had transformed his life in a way that words alone could never convey. And perhaps most importantly, he had discovered that peace, not noise, is the ultimate measure of success. He didn't need them to understand. He didn't need them to approve. He simply needed to honor his own path, his own discipline, and his own worth. And in that calm, quiet space, he found a victory far greater than any recognition. The victory of knowing that inner power, self-respect, and true freedom are cultivated in silence.